I'm over the moon that Dr. Avrum Weiss is joining us to talk about men's silences in relationships. It's something that we know you've written about in Psychologies Today, and there's quite a big chunk of it in your book as well. And I just wanted to explore that subject with you, because men and relationships, men often get overlooked when it comes to dating and relationships. There's so much content out there for women. We're really trying to put some focus and emphasis on bringing men to the table and giving men a voice. And this is a wonderful way to start this whole process, really.
Well, I want to start with an appreciation for what you just said, because I think we're just beginning to do that as a culture. And there's been a lot of pushback about that idea. And so I want to appreciate your moving in that direction, because we do a lot more complaining about men than we do working to try to understand men. And I understand that you are wanting to understand men, and I commend you and appreciate you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. Men are part of the dating process, and we want to embrace them and bring them in and make them feel that they have a voice in this process. And we want to understand what their voice is and where they're coming from.
Yep.
Where does a man's fear come from when it comes to being silent in a relationship? Because it is all fear-based, isn't it, at the end of the day?
Yes, I think so. And that idea is counterintuitive to a lot of people, because it's difficult to understand how a group of people who are the most privileged and the most powerful could also be afraid. Like, what would men have to be afraid of? And there's a lovely graphic in the book, which I think explains it very clearly in one image. And it's a graphic of a male and female stick figure. And not surprised, on a seesaw, teeter-totter, I'm not sure which you call it there. But not surprisingly, the man is in the dominant upper position and the woman is in the one down position. But if you look closely at the image, the woman has 1 foot off of the seesaw. And you realize very quickly that although the man is the dominant position, all she has to do is take her other foot off the teeter-totter and his dominance is gone. He will come crashing down to earth. And so it's a matter of understanding that in any hierarchical situation, that the pain and suffering cannot be on just the one down end, that to inflict dominance on someone else has its own version of pain and suffering. There's a marvelous quote from Martin Luther King, who said that segregation scars the soul of the perpetrator as much as the victim. Wow. Which was an extraordinary thing for him to say. So that's what we have to get past our wanting to blame men for the problems between men and women, and get to a place where we understand how men and women are co-creating these problems, and we'll only be able to resolve them together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And with all the work that you've done, how have you fallen, stumbled, or uncovered the whole silent side of men?
Well, it's easy to see in the culture. I remember an old Jewish joke I was told many, many years ago about a little Jewish boy who comes home to his mother. He's very excited. He says, Mommy, I got a part in the school play. She said, that's wonderful, deal. What part do you have? And he said, I'm playing the part of the Jewish husband. And her mother says, go back and tell the teacher you want a speaking part. So, if you turn on the television or you go to the movies, you would pick up a novel, anywhere in the culture, you will see stereotypes of domineering women and silent men. So we know that stereotypes are exaggerations, but that there is always an element of truth in the stereotype. And so in my field, there's a woman by the name of Dana Jack who has written a book called Silencing the Self. And it was a big breakthrough for women. And she's the first one who really talked about how women are silenced in relationships and how their being silenced harms them. She and I have become friends and correspondents. And I approached her at a talk she gave, and I said, the exact same thing happens to men, right? You know that, right? And she said, I do know that, but nobody's talking about it. And a lot of my colleagues are resistant to talking about it. but she understands that men are silenced in a different way in relationships. And so while women probably more than anything else are unhappy with their partner's silence, they rarely understand the ways in which they are contributing to their partner's silence.
And I'll come back to that. But
Okay.
before we explore that part, I want to look at what creates a silent man. Is it the mother? Is it the upbringing? Is it what happens, as we know, with psychology and all the work that's been done around relationships, that the ages from 0 to 7 play a big part in how someone's going to be as an adult?
Yes.
Is it something that happens then that creates that silence, or is it something else? Is it something that women are doing wrong?
No, it's certainly, I want to be very clear, because occasionally I am misunderstood by people who think that I am blaming women for men's fears. What I'm very clearly trying to say is we're in this together.
Absolutely.
We made this mess together, and we ain't going to get out of it alone. So I am not saying this is women's fault at all. So the answer to your question is all the above. So I'll talk about the two main parts of it, what happens in early life, and then how that is reinforced by gender socialization. So in early life, maybe this is starting to change, although I'm not 100% convinced. I hope it's starting to change. But most of us who are alive today were raised primarily by a woman. Not always. There are some families in which either it's two women raising the child, or two men raising the child, or a family in which the man is much more involved. And that's happening more and more, and I couldn't be happier. But that said, most of us were raised in a family where dad was emotionally not as central a figure as mom. That meant that we had all of our emotional eggs in one basket, mom. So the relationship with mom becomes imbued with a huge amount of importance. And if your listeners are interested, they should Google the still face experiment, which I showed at the conference you invited me to speak at. And it's a series of experiments where the mom is interacting with the child, and they're communicating without words, little babies. And you can see how they're communicating with each other. And then the mom is instructed to turn away for a moment and then look back with just a still face, not an angry or critical or disapproving, just not responding. And within a minute, the infants are absolutely just a mess. They're emotionally distraught. Some of them actually lost bowel and bladder control. So we need our mom's attention, administrations, as much as we need air. Because we are the species that are born. If you watch a horse being born, a minute after it's being born, it's up and running around and doing everything a grown-up horse can do. But human infants are born completely helpless. Mm-hmm. And so we are entirely dependent on, in most cases, our mothers for our literal survival.
Mm. It's all about that primary caregiver, isn't it? Whoever
it has to be. Yeah, because we can't get up and run around after all. We can't get around, we can't eat, we can't communicate. We pretty much just lie there and rely on other people to take care of us for a number of years. So emotionally, what happens is there are inevitably moments where the mom is not as attentive, not because she's not a good mom, but because someone's at the door, or your sister's calling, or I got to make dinner, or any of the things that happen in life. And that works out great if you have two parents who are both emotionally present and available, but most people don't. And so the experience breaks in connection with mom as pretty devastating. Fast forward to adulthood. And actually, the guy who made the still face experiments actually did a videotape of a couple with Sue Johnson, who is perhaps one of the most well-known couples therapists. And they both are saying, watch this couple. It's the same thing that happened in the still face experiment. And so in heterosexual couples, when there is conflicts, men get more physiologically aroused and it takes them longer to recover than women do. They don't look that way. They look like they're tough and stoic and not being affected. But if you hook them up to physiological measures, they are actually more upset, more threatened, more scared, I would say, and it takes them longer to recover because A, their wife is the same gender as mommy if they're heterosexual, so it elicits all that history. And B, unlike their wife, they probably don't really have a close friend that they could turn to when they're in a conflict with their wife. So again, all the eggs, as one person said to me, men outsource their emotional needs to one person. And so everything's on the line.
Yeah. So that level of vulnerability is just elevated completely.
At the same time that they are subject to massive gender role socialization, which tells them, don't be vulnerable. Vulnerability is a weakness. So what they're feeling flooded with, they are also hearing strong cultural messages is bad and wrong and not masculine. So it's a horrible dilemma for men that they mostly, the book is called Hidden in Plain Sight because it's right there, but you can't see it unless you know where to look for it.
And it is literally hidden in plain sight.
Yes.
I mean, what advice would you give to a man in this situation? Before we look at the woman's role, I want to stay with what tips and tools we can give to men.
Sure.
About vulnerability and allowing them to be vulnerable in a masculine way that doesn't make them feel emasculated, or belittled in the relationship.
The good news is, and the surprise I think to a lot of people is, I think men become so stoic that they forget and women forget that they were ever any different. So people start to think that it's because you're male in your gender that you aren't as emotionally open or vulnerable. And that, I can tell you with certainty, is not true.
No, it's not.
Yeah. If you look at little boys, their friendships with each other are as intimate and as vulnerable and as close and as important to them as girls' relationships are. And so that's not where we started.
Yeah.
And then essentially men get the vulnerability beaten out of them by a culture that mocks and humiliates them when they are vulnerable. There's a lovely concept which is getting talked about a lot now called fragile masculinity. And the idea is that women are born with a sense of identity as female, those who do have an identity as female, and they don't question it. They don't have a period in their lives where they wonder, am I really a woman? But men are born with the idea that masculinity is not something that's inherent to you. It's something that must be earned. This is why so many cultures have initiation rites. Yes. So you're not a man until we take you out and torture you for a few days.
Okay.
So you have to earn it. And then it is always, every second of every day, subject to revocation. If you act in any way that is taken to be feminine-like, we interpret that as not masculine. In other words, we interpret masculinity as the absence of femininity. There's not really a template for how to be a man other than don't act like a woman. And so men walk around with a constant sense of anxiety about this, largely unknown, unrecognized, because they're sort of always watching themselves to make sure they're not doing or saying or acting anything that might make them appear to be feminine. And this is certainly true in business. And sadly also true in relationships where men get scared and sort of armor up when really you're looking at a scared little boy who's acting like a tough grown-up, but down inside there is a sweet, vulnerable, innocent little kid.
So how does that play out in dating? Because we're talking a lot about relationships, but a lot of people listening to this will probably be single and wanting to get into a relationship. So for women to understand men better and for men to understand themselves better within this role, what advice do you give to the men, for starters, when they're dating? And how, I mean, I always tell my clients, be your authentic self. But sometimes they find that difficult and they don't know often who their authentic self is. So there's a lot of work to do around identifying that authenticity.
Right. Well, I mean, absolutely. I agree with everything you just said. And of course, it's difficult to be your authentic self because there are all kinds of cultural consequences for being yourself. So the whole culture is set up to get people to conform, not because it's evil, but because it's efficient.
Yes.
So like when you come to work at 9 o'clock in the morning, we don't want you to be hungry until 12 o'clock when you break for lunch. If you happen to get hungry,
if you're hungry at 10?
Well, you might get hungry at 10, but we don't want you to break for lunch at 10. It's easier for us if everybody just breaks we don't have to watch you and count your hour. I'm using a silly example, but I think it applies more broadly. And so if you find yourself in a situation where people have sort of agreed to do something and you don't, first of all, it's unlikely that you'll even let yourself notice if you don't. And if you do, you realize that the people who are already doing it will be uncomfortable if you say you don't want to do it. So back to your question. I can give you an embarrassingly painful personal example. On my first date with my wife, I literally told her that we would never be a match because we were so different. Fortunately, and I was doing what many men do, which is they approach dating as if it were some kind of formula, and as if similarity were the thing to look for, like lining up in different dimensions, which is hilarious when you think about it. Because if you're talking about heterosexual couples, they already have the biggest difference I know of in the world. So that's what I was doing. I was looking at my wife and I come from very different backgrounds. And I said to her, if we knew each other in high school, I would have hated you, which is true. Fortunately, women are a lot smarter about this process than men tend to be. And so she understood that there was a good connection with us and basically said, well, let's just come to my house for dinner next week and we'll talk more about this. She says, and I believe her, that she knew from reading my profile that we would be a good connection. I was lost in the details and missed the sort of experience of what was happening. So for men, I try to make it as simple as possible. Well, I would say the same thing to a woman too, but you've come back from your first date and I get these obsessive lists of, why it's a good match, why it's not a good match. I'm like, no. I just got two questions for you. One, did you enjoy yourself?
Yes.
If you enjoyed yourself, why wouldn't you go back? Like if you try a new restaurant and you like it, I think you're probably going to go back. And if you didn't like it, I don't think you're going back. So it's very simple. Did you like it? And the second one's a little more complicated, which is, but I think just as important. Did you like the version of yourself that you were with that person? Because
that's interesting.
We are all
Absolutely
different. Yeah, in every relationship, we are different. And connection is about, I like me when I'm with you. I like the way we go together. And I like how my life is going with you as my partner.
Now, it's interesting because there's two questions I ask, and they're very similar. One is, how did they make you feel?
Exactly.
And how do you think you made them feel?
Yes. So if I may tweak your language a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't think we make anybody feel anything. So I just say it even more simply. How did you feel?
How did you feel?
You're with them, and how do you think they felt when they were with you?
Yes. Interesting. I love that.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to write that one down for later.
And it's really
it's about feelings, isn't it? It's about how you feel. And these people that come with these long lists to me and to the team, I despair. Someone's got to be over a certain height. They've got to be a certain breast size. They've got to have a certain income bracket. These are all things that I class as fluid. And an income bracket can change where someone lives, what car they drive, what job they have. All of those things change. So obviously a height can't change, but how important really is it when it comes to dating at the end of the day?
Well, I'd say if that is the most important factor to you, I hope nobody I love marries you. Because that's fine if that's the most important thing to you, but would not be the person I would be looking for. I would not want to be partnered with somebody who was so cut and dried and not open to. So first of all those things, or not height, but most of them, as you point out, are going to change over the course of a relationship.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for someone to spend the rest of your life with, they're not going to stay the same anyway.
No, nobody does. The thing about all of us is we all change constantly.
Hopefully.
And what ways do you think men in particular can learn to not feel ashamed and embarrassed about their vulnerability and about addressing their needs, wants and wishes in a relationship? Because when I read through your article, the thing that pained me more than anything was the lack of a voice that Bill had.
Yes, exactly. I appreciate your empathic response to that, because I don't think it often gets acknowledged. Mm-hmm. So the surprising answer to your question, what has surprised me about this, is how much more open and vulnerable men are talking to other men than they are talking to women. And so most of the stereotypes that we have about men in terms of their being withdrawn and silent and resistant are largely true of men in mixed company. And much to my surprise, when I started doing psychotherapy groups for just men, it's like a room full of what you think women would be like. They are open, disclosing, vulnerable. I've been running groups for literally over 50 years. And the only time I have ever heard people consistently say to each other in a group, look each other in the eye and say, I love you, are in groups of men. In mixed groups, I do not hear people being that open. But in the groups I do with men, they talk about how important the relationship is for them, and loving each other and relying on each other. So to come back to your question, I think the starting place for most men is to develop relationships with other men where they can sort of learn more emotional comfort and fluency and depth in a setting that is more comfortable to them, and then begin to bring that into their primary relationships. I think it just goes better that way.
And it's interesting, and I'm going to bring something in that's kind of pertinent for mothers who are bringing up young men.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, because I think we've got to make some generational changes somewhere. And for mothers who are bringing up young men, I mean, my son's 19. I'd like to think he's emotionally vulnerable. He's got a good group of male friends. They're very close. They've always have been. So I've tried to do everything that's right, but it is something that you always worry about. I do, as a mother of a son. Sure. He's getting all the emotional needs and everything else that he needs so that he one day can be a good partner and potentially a good father.
Yeah.
What can we do as women and as mothers to give our sons the tools that they need to be the men of the future?
It's a great question. I really like it. I have two thoughts about that. One is I've only had one bumper sticker in my life, and it is sitting on my desk over there. And it says, less judgment, more curiosity. And it's a great saying to live your life by. I think there probably couldn't be war if we actually all lived with that idea. And so I think as a woman raising a boy or young man, or as a man raising a young woman, I think what's called for is curiosity. Yeah. So I think rather than having a preformed idea of what masculinity would mean to one person, to be interested and curious about his thoughts about masculinity, his thought about close relationships, his thoughts about, it's essentially a matter of respect, of meeting him or her where they are, as opposed to thinking that you already know the answer, because if you say, what are the characteristics of being masculine? If you give me 10 people, I'll give you 10 answers. I don't think there is a way of being masculine or male. It varies. Every person is different. And so I think as a mom, really what you want to do is to be open to what their answer may be, something you never thought of.
Yeah. And not shut them down and not inflict your views and your family tradition and history. Well, this is how we bring boys up. This is because I hear that a lot from other people. It always surprises me that it's parents feel it's okay to impose their views on how a child should be.
And it's not just the parent, it's the culture as well. I remember my son was a very good soccer player. And I remember the time when he made the real leap to a really more cutthroat, aggressive league. And in the middle of a game, he knocked another player over. He's a big kid. And he did what he was accustomed to doing. He reached down to give the other kid a hand up. His teammates gave him crap up one side and down the other. And they were teaching him, listen, buddy, in this culture, men don't help other people. Men are not cooperative. He's on the other team. We're here to beat him. It was a very clear lesson for him. Do not be collaborative. Do not be sensitive or think about the other person's needs. Fortunately, that did not become his approach, but you could just see the culture right there. You could just see how a sensitive kid would be retrained by that culture. Because to be accepted by his teammates, they wanted him to be more aggressive and less collaborative. And that, of course, happens, 100 times a day.
It does. I mean, I'm hoping and I'm thinking, and hopefully we're seeing it more in sport, and we're seeing it with mental health awareness and about collaboration and about supporting each other and good sportsmanship and all of the things that we hear about, that I'd like to think that doesn't happen anymore, but sadly it does.
Oh, no. Sadly, it absolutely does. And I think we're maybe a little naive about thinking how much things have changed, and probably not as much as we imagined they have. And it's just something we have to keep. It's difficult. I mean, every time you want to do things in a way that differs from gender stereotypes, there's resistance, there's a push, I've worked with a lot of guys who are stay-at-home dads, and they will tell you that at social events, they dread being asked, what do you do? Because they feel embarrassed about, or they anticipate that other people will, they'll shame them when they're doing they're doing exactly what they want to do, and they love what they're doing, until they get to a setting with other men where they anticipate being shamed.
And it is about shame and fear at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
And women have gone through this evolution process in the last probably 30 to 50 years, and quite a fast-paced one, with equality and all the things that women have changed so much, but I feel men are still playing catch up.
I don't think there's any doubt about it.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how men can have their growth period, and what that evolutionary growth period for men could or possibly is looking like. Yeah.
I'll answer you in a sort of hopelessly naive way. Unfortunately, I think what's happening is that women are learning bad habits from men. And I wish what were happening were men were more learning good habits from women. So like women's rate of stress-related disease is climbing and approaching men's rate of. So I would rather that men's rate of stress-related disease would come like that. We would learn from you to not make ourselves some crazy, but instead you're learning from us to make yourself as crazy as we are. So I wish we could sort of reverse the way the halves are coming together. But I don't think that's going to happen. And so I think that, again, I think there's a real need for men to talk with each other to figure out some of these things. One of the sections in the book that is most important to me is a chapter addressed to men to help them find other men to connect with and form groups to talk with each other about some of these issues. And I suggest that they use the book, start like a book club, go through the book together as a sort of less threatening way of coming together. And then, hey, you're all there. Why not just keep meeting and keep talking? And I think groups like that are really potentially life-changing for men.
It's that camaraderie, isn't it, where men are not feeling that they're so alone. And it's almost doing full circle, because that's very much how it used to be.
Yes.
And I think men have lost that in a certain way. And what we need them to go back to that. You know, the boys clubs, the men's,
absolutely,
the doing things together, so that they're re-energizing, I guess, in some way, their masculinity.
Yeah, unfortunately, the history of those men's clubs is that they were largely organized. Groups like some of the fraternal organizations and the Boy Scouts were organized to stop what they saw as the feminization of men. And so they were built to make men sort of more macho and more tough. And that's not the kind of group that you and I are talking about.
No, not at all. Not at all.
But if you go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, there's a huge trauma that occurs in the lives of men in the Industrial Revolution. So however many generations you have to go back, your great-great-grandfather, or however many, worked at home, farmed, or raised livestock, or was, but mostly worked at home with children involved in the process, helping out where they could. And so fathers were an integral, hour by hour, morning, noon, and night, part of their families. They weren't separated. The Industrial Revolution, work becomes something that you go to. You leave your family and go to work, and fathers become absent figures in the lives of children, which we know is a problem for children, but it's also a problem for men to have the best part of their day. When they come home, they're exhausted. So they're torn from their family for the best part of their day.
And COVID has brought men back to homes.
Yes. And created a lot of distress.
And I was going to say, in some cases it's been wonderful, but in other cases, it's created even more separation within the home. We've seen a lot of couples split up and separate.
Yes.
And we're seeing a lot of clients coming to us who've been divorced and separated because of COVID for this particular reason. Because
it was not COVID on Monday, and then on Tuesday it was COVID.
Yeah.
So
there was no
nobody
preparation.
Nobody had a chance. I remember very clearly the first day that we were all told, where I lived, we were on a lockdown. You weren't supposed to leave your home except for emergency.
Yeah.
And the first day, my wife before COVID was working at home. And I said to her innocently, "What time would you like to have lunch today?" And she looked at me like, "I don't have lunch with you. Like, I've been having lunch by myself for a long time, buddy. Like, if you don't have lunch with me, ask me if I want." So I just assumed that we would now be together at lunch. And then we had to talk about that and work it out. And I think if you don't have great communication in your relationship and you've sort of settled into a rhythm of alone and together time, and then all of a sudden it's all together time, how do you say to your husband or your girlfriend or whatever, how do you say, I love being with you, but not all the time. I really enjoyed having lunch by myself during the day, and I'd kind of like, or whatever it is that works for you. Those are difficult conversations.
They are difficult conversations, but it is all about communication and how you communicate with someone. I think that's very true in dating, and it's very true in the early days of dating. Is testing that vulnerability out, testing your voice with somebody. Yes. In that
very
relationship.
Important.
Because
very important
if
point.
You can't be yourself, and you don't feel you've got a voice and you can be heard, why continue in that vein, really?
Well, you're absolutely right. But the problem is, of course, that people are so afraid to be alone that they're willing to sacrifice being themselves in order to not be alone. And it seems like a reasonable deal at the time. But of course, over time, you develop resentments. You start blaming the other person for you choosing to not be yourself. and then it doesn't go well.
Yeah. Now it's interesting. One of our team actually sent me a question to ask you.
Great.
So this is from one of our male team members. And he said, growing up, I've had to be the emotional support and person to vent to for my mother, but never able to do the same, as my mother would snap at me for my problems not being important enough in the conversation. I recognize that I've been conflict avoidant because of it with friends and significant others. How do I work on myself to speak up and not be afraid of conflict?
Wow, that's a great question. If your mother is telling you that your problems are not important enough, I think the implicit message is that you are not important enough. And that's exactly. That's a really about as awful a message as one could ever hear from one's parents, that you really aren't that important. So it sounds like his mom was really using him in a lot of ways to meet her needs, but that it wasn't, we don't even expect a parent-child relationship to be reciprocal. We expect it to be pretty one-sided. This relationship wasn't even reciprocal. It was one-sided in the wrong direction. But of course, as a child, you don't have a frame of reference to compare it to. You don't have any way of knowing that this is not how it's supposed to be. And so for him, he needs to be in close relationships, romantic or otherwise, with people who think he's the most interesting, fascinating, important, valuable person they ever met, and who tell him on a regular basis, I'm so glad we got together today. I had so much fun. I mean, it doesn't have to be you're the best person in the world. It just has to be people who enjoy him and look forward to seeing him again and don't think he's a burden.
That's wonderful. And that's so healing. And often we say that you heal yourself when you get into the right relationship.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's not until you're in that right relationship that the healing doesn't really take place, does it?
Right. And I mean, this will be another time, but the irony is that the very things that will be most healing to us are the things we use to push away from.
Totally agree on that one. Yeah. And it's often, I mean, we'll deep dive that one. I'm going to park that one to deep dive with you.
Well, I'll give you we will, but let me give just a very concrete example. People come back after dates and they say to me, he didn't offer to pick up the check. That's it. We're done. Well, he's a cheap bastard and I don't even want to see him again. I'm like, well, I don't know if he's a cheap bastard, because he doesn't know how upset you are that he didn't pick up the check. There is no rule written anywhere that says that the man should pick up the check. What we're talking about is you would prefer he pick up the check, but you haven't told him that. And so that he didn't pick up the check is not a good sign or a bad sign. What is important is what happens after you tell him, look, my dad never paid for anything. I always felt like I didn't deserve anything. And for me, it's really important for a man to, at least on whatever your history is that makes that important to you, that you tell him that. And then it's what happens the second time that matters. Yeah.
It's very true. And it goes back down to expectations. And that's another topic that we will deep dive.
Okay, I'll look forward to it.
We're definitely going to deep dive on expectations. Great. Because that's one of the biggest things that stops people being in a relationship and stops any relationship that they're starting.
Yep, they don't give it a chance.
They don't. So the final question I want to ask you, and I think this is one for the girls, is how can a woman help their male partner or someone they've just met find their voice and feel comfortable enough to open up emotionally with them?
Yeah. Well, it's a big question you just asked, and we may not have time for all of it today, but
just a few tidbits.
Yeah, sure. What women don't realize is, let me think how to say this. Okay, I've started a new project, and any of your listeners are welcome to email me about that if they want to be interviewed on this project. I am asking women, what did you learn from your mom about men? What did your mom teach you about men, not just in the words she told you, but in the way she behaved towards your father? And most of what women learn is pretty critical of men. Many of their moms were very disappointed in their relationships with their father and taught their daughter by modeling some pretty critical ideas about men, like not to trust them, not to rely on them, not to think you're going to be close with them. So this is in the air. So in a relationship between men and women. And so then when you say to me, how can women help men to be more open and forthcoming, is to look at the ways in which, without meaning to, you are being critical and judgmental of your partner, and notice that as you do less of that, that he is more outspoken and forthcoming. That's a hard thing to do, is to look and see that I am sort of poised and ready to be critical of you because it's how I was raised. But of course, you're not opening up with me, because when you do, I'm usually pretty critical of it. And so I'm a part of your being shut down. And the good news is I can be a part of your being more open too.
So women really need to use those words of affirmation.
Absolutely.
And tell their man what they enjoy about being with them. And
absolutely.
When it comes to dating, thank them for the lovely experience and tell them why they'd like to see them again, and give the praise that they want to receive. And
absolutely,
in turn, men should and often do give the praise back to the woman.
At the risk of oversimplifying, yes. I learned a lot about this from my dog trainer.
Okay.
And what my dog trainer told me was that this mistake that almost everybody makes is they don't give enough reinforcement, and they don't do it often enough. So they're trying to teach their dog to heel or go outside or whatever, and they give a treat here and a treat there. They're like, no, handfuls of treats, lots of treats. You can't give too many treats. Your dog is not going to be like, oh, no more treats, no more love, no more appreciation. I've had enough.
They might not be able to walk or get outside to do anything.
But it's the same thing with people. Every time I'm with a couple, almost every time, one person will make a move to do something different. They'll actually do what the other one has been complaining that they never do. So let's say the guy does it, and then the woman sits there silently. And I'm like, wait a minute, for 6 months, you've been asking him to notice this or be more appreciative of that. So when he does that, you need to come with the treats. You need to give lots of reinforcement, because if you don't, it's just going to die on the vine. It's going to be one example of something better that didn't go anywhere. So you slather on the appreciation. Oh my God, I've been waiting 6 months. It's even better than I thought. I love it when you do that. Thank you so much. Please do it again. Like that.
It's really that simple, isn't it?
It is. We're not that different from our dogs. When it comes to how you get someone to do something,
it's really that simple.
You cannot, contrary to popular opinion, you cannot, train a dog to go outside by yelling at it when it pees in the house. It doesn't understand what you're doing. And you just teach the dog to be afraid of you.
Yeah.
You don't train a human being to be more the way you want them by yelling at them or criticizing them or judging them. It's the same way. It works with reinforcement.
It's like children as well. It's praise and encouragement.
Absolutely.
That reaffirms the good behavior.
Yep.
And try and ignore the bad behavior unless it's really, really bad. So it's picking your moment.
Because it works. It works.
Work. But I think we get lazy. People get lazy in relationships. And again, it goes back to expectations. They just expect because they've said it once, they're going to keep saying it. And it's the same when people come back from a date and we ask for feedback. I always say, tell me 3 things that you really liked about your date. And what they want to do more often than not is tell me everything they didn't like about their date. And it's like, whoa, stop. That's not what I've asked you. Let's focus on the positives. We can talk ourselves into and out of any situation at the end of the day.
Yeah. And if you are thinking about the 3 things that didn't go well, it won't go well.
It's not going to go well. But if you set yourself up and your partner up, or your potential new partner up to succeed, then that's going to go really well. So Avrum, to summarize the whole silencing of men, which is a very sad and heavy topic in reality when you deep dive into what it signifies, really. As women, we've got learning points here, and our learning points are praise, encouragement, and give space and allow your partner or your date to have a voice. And the learning point for men is for them to find these groups of men so that they feel that they can have a voice and that camaraderie to feel safe to test it out before they test it out at home.
Absolutely. And I'd add one small thing for the women's point of view, which is to realize that the judgments and cultural assumptions you have about men not wanting to be more open are not true. They've pulled the wool over your eyes. That men are just as interested in being close as women are, and don't believe that they're not. Because if you believe that, then you expect that. But if you realize that men are just as interested and just as hungry for affection and intimacy as you are, it's just a little harder to see.
I love that. And I'm going to end it there because that's just the perfect place.
Okay, good.
Thank you. A million.
My pleasure.
I can't wait to do more of these deep dives with you.
Me too.
And for anyone who's listening, please follow us at the Matchmaking Company. And Dr. Avrum Weiss is very easy to find. He's got his own website. He's got his wonderful new book, Hidden in Plain Sight. And we're all very collaborative, and we want to hear from you and support you in any way that we can.
Yeah, and send in questions.
Sending questions. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.